So in 930 BC, the nation of Israel divided two kingdoms, the northern territory of Israel, colored in green on your screen, and the southern territory of Judah, colored in purple. The Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. On your screen is the extent of the Assyrian Empire. In 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by Babylon. The Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple and exiled or deported the people of Judah to Babylon. They were in exile for 70 years. On your screen is the extent of the Babylonian Empire. In 539 BC, Babylon falls to Persia, the extent of the Persian Empire on your screen. So ABP is the key to remembering the world empires of the Old Testament. The Assyrians fell to the Babylonians fell to the Persians. Cyrus, the king of Persia, sent a proclamation called the Decree of Cyrus, allowing the captured nation of Judah to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Many chose to stay behind, and that is where we're picking up today's story in the book of Esther. This takes place under the Persian rule in the city of Susa in Persia. We're in chapter 1. The book takes place in the days of King Artaxerxes, also known as King Xerxes. His grandfather was King Cyrus the Great. Verse 1, King Xerxes reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. This is a powerful king. He rules a very vast empire. He is the supreme ruler of the world at the time. Verse 3, he hosts a banquet or a feast for all the nobles, for all the princes of his provinces. This banquet is really to display his own glory, and we can pick up on that in verse 4. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days. 180 days he's showing off. When that feast was over, another festival began. This time a week-long banquet for his city, for all the people in Susa. Now Susa is the capital of Persia. Notice in verse 6, the writer draws you into the party's grandeur. Fine white and violet linen, silver and marble columns, couches of gold and silver. This palace was designed to stun, to take your breath away, to leave you in no doubt about the wealth of the king. And in verse 7, drinks served in golden vessels, so wines flowing freely. And in verse 8, there's only one rule, and that is to drink as you please. Verses 10 and 11, on the last day of the party, the king's drinking a little too much. He's drunk and he calls for his wife. He says, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. He wants to show her off to the people because she's beautiful. Notice that he is treating her like another one of his elaborate things. He's just wanting to show her off like a trophy wife. This is all about him. He has limitless power, limitless riches, the most beautiful wife, and she'll come at his command. Verse 12, but Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. He controls everything, down to how the people drink at his party, but he has no control. And he loses it. He has the power, the prestige, the influence, the money, but his marriage is a sham. This gives us insight of what's really happening behind closed doors. He's really empty and now embarrassed in front of his guests. His wife refuses to come. And in verse 13, this great, powerful king cannot control his temper tantrum. So he summons wise men to come up with a solution to this problem. And they decide that Vashti must go. She's a terrible example to the women of Persia, they say, and she is to never again be in the king's presence. In his drunken anger, he mandates that men should be masters of their home. And this is just laughable. A man cannot demand or force respect from his wife, and that's what he is trying to mandate. Leadership in the home calls for the husband to love his wife and wives to respect their husbands, but we can tell by reading the text that he isn't devoted to her. He isn't loving her or giving himself up for her in servant leadership. He wants to show her off to make himself look good. She is his tool, his plaything, and a wife is not your property. Treat her with respect, love her, honor her, give her a reason to treat you the same. In the New Testament, Paul shows that submission is not one-sided, but a reciprocal relationship. A husband ought to devote himself to his wife's good. I'm actually going to read the verse, Ephesians 5, verse 33. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Reading this chapter, we learn that the king's pursuit of wealth, prestige, and power left him empty and foolish. That's something you can't respect. He cared more about his possessions than he cared about loving his wife. Chapter 2 and verse 1, when the king's anger subsides, and I'm assuming he sobered up, he remembered what happened between him and Vashti. The queen had been dethroned and he was without a queen. So in verses 2 and 3, his advisors propose a search throughout the empire to gather every beautiful young woman. Gather these women like they're animals. They're going to gather women and bring them to the king. They're searching for Vashti's replacement. This plan pleased the king. We read that in verse 4, verse 5. Now there was at Citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Mordecai is a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin. Verse 6, it gives details on why they're living in Susa. They were taken to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. In the book of Ezra, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Remember, King Cyrus issued a decree. But Mordecai and Esther are still living in that territory, now ruled by Persia. They didn't return even though they could have. Verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Notice the verse introduces Esther by her Hebrew name, Hadassah. The writer is reminding us that though this family has been living in this foreign land, they are still people of God's promise. Esther is her Persian Babylonian name. Esther was orphaned and her cousin Mordecai adopted her. He became the guardian. Verse 8. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. The use of the word taken shows that she, nor Mordecai, had a choice in the matter. Esther, along with many young ladies, were snatched from their homes, taken to the king's palace. So this is wrong. In verse 9, she finds favor with the officer in charge of the women, and she was given special beauty preparations. And in verse 10, Mordecai instructed her to hide her identity as a Jew. And one possibility as to why her identity was hidden could be because the Jews made enemies of the people that they had driven out of Israel. We actually learn in chapter 3 of the book of Esther, there's a man who was an Amalekite, one of Israel's enemies, and he plots to destroy all the Jews. So this could be the reason why Esther and Mordecai's Hebrew names were changed to conceal their identity and to stay protected. In verse 11, every day Mordecai walked back and forth just checking on the welfare of Esther. Verses 12 through 13, for a year these women lived in a harem. A harem is a chamber for concubines. One by one, these young women were required to spend the night, each in turn, in the king's bed. And though they lived pampered lives, this is unfortunate. If the king never called them again, they were destined to remain secluded in the harem for the rest of their lives. So notice in verse 14, they are in custody to a man in charge of the concubines. Esther, along with all these women, were victims. This isn't a Cinderella story of a beauty contest. I've read some commentaries that portray this story like it's a contest in search of the next Miss Persia, but we have to read these verses carefully to understand that this was not voluntary. In verse 15, now it was Esther's turn to go to the king, and she found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. In verse 17, above all the women, she obtained the king's favor, and Esther is crowned as queen. Now, though this story is ugly and kind of painful to read, when we read it with the lens that these young women were abducted and taken based on their looks, we have to remind ourselves that God has a plan. God can use evil and turn it into good. If you recall the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, remember he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was imprisoned, and yet he knew that what was intended for evil, God intended for good. This is the story of Esther. Esther and Mordecai are exiles in a broken home, in a strange land. She's an orphan, a woman, a Jew, forced into a life she would never choose, and yet God uses her to accomplish his purposes. Here, a Jew becomes the queen of Persia, the queen of an empire which comprised more than half of the known world. Even Mordecai serves a high civil position. We read that in verse 19. Verse 21, he's in the royal court and he overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and Mordecai tells Esther the plot. The plot was investigated and revealed to be true. The men who tried to assassinate the king were killed. And that's the end of the chapter. This chapter reminds us that God uses his weakest servants for his greatest works. In her weakness and brokenness, a victim of malice and hatred of the mighty and political elites, it is Esther who still loves her enemy. She's informing the king of this assassination attempt. God brought Esther and Mordecai to the place where they were the only ones able to rescue the king. And though this king is an enemy, God is going to use the enemy to serve his purposes. Chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. After these events, King Xerxes promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. So no reason was given for the promotion of Haman, but one would think that it would be Mordecai who would get promoted, since Mordecai saved the king's life. Yet the opening of chapter 3 tells us Haman the Agagite was promoted. Wow. The mention of Haman's ancestry is important because it gives us a background on who Haman is. Israel has a deep history with the Amalekites. When Israel exited Egypt, it was the Amalekites who attacked them. In the book of Samuel, King Saul spared the king of the Amalekites, and that king's name was Agag. That is where we get the title Haman the Agagite. So Haman is an enemy of Israel. Everyone but Mordecai bows down to Haman. His refusal not to bow down wasn't because he was petty over not being promoted. It had more to do with the long-standing enmity between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Verse 4, day after day they spoke to Mordecai about the matter, and Mordecai took his stand. His reason for not bowing is because he is a Jew, so he reveals his heritage. Verses 5 and 6, Haman was filled with rage. He set out to find a way to kill all the Jews, not just Mordecai, but a genocide of the Jewish people. Verse 9, Haman then issues a massacre on the Jews, and he's willing to bear the costs involved in carrying out the killings. Verse 10, the king gave Haman his signet ring. This ring functioned as the king's signature. Instead of signing their name, they would press their ring into hot wax or clay to make their mark. Giving Haman this ring was a stamp of approval and authority to act in the king's name. Verse 11, the king told Haman to do with the people as you please. Verses 12 through 14, the call for the death of all Jewish people, including women and children, was issued. Now this was sent out to rulers of every province. Remember, he rules a vast province, over 127. It was sent out to all of those provinces in various languages, and it was published to all people. Annihilate, execute, destroy the Jews. And in verse 15, Then Haman and the king sat down for a couple of drinks. This conflict is not between the Amalekites and Israel. This conflict is that of God and that of Satan. A conflict between righteousness and wickedness. But God is always working on behalf of his people. We know how the story ends. The battle has already been won. Christ died and is risen and is now Lord over all. The Hamans of this world cannot defeat what God has already declared and what God said he would accomplish. Chapter 3 ends with the city of Susa was in confusion. So this was an alarming and unusual decree. If this happened to the Jews, then who's next on the list to be annihilated? That's what the people are thinking. And just think about this for a moment. In our present day, since the October 7th attack on Israel, a 700% increase in anti-Semitic incidents have occurred on college campuses. Jews are not safe. They are isolated. They are under attack and threatened. Various organizations and individuals have financially supported the initiatives that spread radical Islamic ideology, and that contributes to attacks on Jews and Israel. So who's to stop them from coming after the Christian next? We are in a spiritual battle. That's what Ephesians 6 tells us, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil. So guys, take courage and stand firm. So we're going to start in Esther chapter 4, 1 through 3. Great mourning is among the Jews. They're fasting, they're weeping and wailing. And in verse 4, Esther appears to be unaware of Haman's plot and the uproar outside the palace grounds. So Mordecai is weeping at the palace gates. He's wearing sackcloth, which signified public mourning. So Esther sends a change of clothes to Mordecai, but he doesn't accept them. So she then sends one of her servants to find out what's going on. Mordecai tells Esther's servant Haman's plot to execute the Jews. And in verse 8, he gives a copy of the decree that was issued to the servant so the servant can inform Esther. He requests that Esther plead with the king and intervene on behalf of her people. Verse 9, the servant relays the message from Mordecai to Esther, and in verse 10, Esther replies back to Mordecai, and this is what she says in verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. To go to the king uninvited is a death sentence. She's telling Mordecai, you should know that the king hasn't wanted to see me for about a month. I'm not sure your plan is a very good idea. Verse 13, Mordecai says, well, don't think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. Once the king finds out you're a Jew, you'll die too, queen or not. So Esther has a choice to make. She can stay in the palace and hide behind her Persian alter ego, or she comes clean and reveals that she's a Jew. In chapter 2, verse 10, remember she had not revealed her nationality and her family background, but now she is faced with a choice, and that is the same with us. We face that choice daily. We are either people of God or living like a child of the world. Up until this point, Esther has been living as a Persian queen, but she was first introduced to us as a Hebrew orphan, one who had to conceal her identity as a child of the promise, a child of the covenant, a people of God. Esther has to choose her allegiance just like we have to choose our allegiance. Chapter 4, verse 14, it's our highlighted verse, so go back in your Bible and highlight this verse. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. That's what Mordecai is saying to Esther. Could it be that you have come to the kingdom for just this moment? You are in a unique place in the providence of God with unique opportunities and responsibilities. You are God's instrument for such a time as this. Mordecai has unshakable hope. He knows the faithfulness of the Lord. He says, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. If you, Esther, don't go to the king, don't think that your failure to fulfill your duty will somehow derail God's plan. Salvation does not rest on you, but on God. But who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Wow, what an amazing passage to reflect on. Jesus Christ claims our allegiance. He calls us to face the cost of discipleship. Yes, it's hard and it's scary and there will be a cost to be paid, but we have to make a choice. There is no way we can be a secret Christian living a public worldly lifestyle. We are told that friendship with the world is enmity against God. If we belong to God, we need to ask ourselves the same questions. Has God brought me to this moment and to this place? Maybe it's your workplace or the town you live in or your web of relationships and friendships. Has God brought you to a place to be His instrument? And will we take those opportunities? God calls us to recognize the double life we've been living. Will we step up to our obligations? Notice that Mordecai is telling Esther, you're not our only hope. Relief and deliverance will arise if she chooses not to face her responsibilities, because he knows that salvation belongs to the Lord. We have that great commission, which is to know God and to make Him known. That's our duty. That's our responsibility. But we know that salvation belongs to God. But take those opportunities, because like Mordecai says, who knows whether you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe you're at the right place at the right time and you share the gospel and someone accepts Jesus. Who knows? Esther makes a choice, as I hope you do too. She resolves her fears in verses 15 through 16. She calls the people of God to continue fasting and she will join them. She will go to the king, which is against the law, and this is her defining moment. She says, if I perish, I perish. How amazing. Esther doing the will of God. Remember, Jesus said, not as I will, but as you will. Has God brought you to your state, your city, your workplace, or wherever for such a time as this, that you might share the gospel to bring salvation to God's people? Or maybe you yourself haven't received Jesus Christ and you're hearing this message, and God in His sovereign purpose brought you to hear this message to accept salvation through Jesus Christ. Maybe you and I are here for such a time as this. I don't know. Chapter 4 kind of left us with a cliffhanger. Mordecai tells Esther that she should face her responsibility or her divine calling and go to the king uninvited and plead for her people, risking her life in the process. So the king hasn't seen her for 30 days. So chapter 5 verse 1 and 2. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's room, and the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Esther received life, not death, mercy, not condemnation, hope, not fear. Just imagine the terror she must have felt only moments before. The Lord heard the cries of His people and answered. For 3 days, Esther and the people fasted. Now, fasting implies prayer. So Esther looked to God, not man, for her deliverance. Verse 3, the king said to Esther, what in the world would move you to risk your neck to come to the throne room without an invite? This must be a special request. What is your request? Verse 4, Esther replies, will you and Haman come to a banquet, a party that I have prepared? So no doubt the king's curious about Esther's request, so he and Haman attend her banquet. So at the banquet, the king repeats his offer. In verse 6, he says, what do you want? You can have anything up to half my kingdom. In verse 8, she replies, come to my party again tomorrow and I'll tell you everything. So now there's 2 parties. The suspense must be killing him. So in verses 9 through 10, Haman Haman is heading home. He's happy, he's high in spirits, but when he sees Mordecai standing at the king's gate, he became so mad he has to restrain himself. Verse 11, when he gets home, he gathers all his friends and his wife, friends and family, and he starts to boast about his wealth, his position, all his promotions that the king has honored him with. And verse 12 is hilarious. He's like, oh, and not only that, but Queen Esther invited me to a banquet tomorrow. Verse 13 says, but despite all that, there's just one thing that drives him nuts. Just one little thing. Mordecai. Haman has the money, he has the power, but he doesn't have respect. That's something you cannot force or buy, and it's driving him nuts. His obsession with Mordecai is poisoning him. So his wife and his friends suggest that they should set up a pole reaching about 75 feet high and ask the king to have Mordecai impaled. Notice the size of the pole, 75 feet tall. Haman's pride and ego just match that height. Haman was pleased with this advice, so he had the pole or the gallows made, and in the morning he's going to ask the king to have Mordecai executed. Esther doesn't even know of Mordecai's death plot that Haman is planning. It's out of her hands entirely. She can do nothing. Earlier, we discussed that Mordecai had unshakable hope. He knows that relief and deliverance will arise regardless if Esther steps up. Well, in chapter 6, we will see the wise providence of God. Verse 1, during that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. That very night that Haman is setting up this 75-foot pole that he plans to hang Mordecai on, the king, meanwhile, couldn't sleep. So the king requests to be read to. He wants to be read a reading of his reign. Now, this king has reigned for over 12 years. And out of all the texts that could have been read about his reign, this is the text that was read to him. Verse 2, it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. In chapter 2, Mordecai saved the king from an assassination attempt. It was recorded in the king's records, but 4 to 5 years have gone by, and Mordecai has gone completely unrewarded. So the king responds in verse 3, the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who attended him said nothing has been done for him. So all thought of a good night's sleep has been abandoned now. Something has to be done to put things right. And so the king says in verse 4, who's in the king's court? Now Haman had just entered the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. Do you see the providence that's happening right now? In God's design, this very night, the king couldn't sleep. He has read from a text about Mordecai that saved his life. He's like, something needs to be done about this. At the same time, Haman has just entered the palace to speak to the king about killing Mordecai. God was at work for the good of Mordecai in ways beyond understanding. It's just hard not to laugh out loud when the king asks, who's in the court? And the king's attendants, oh yeah, Haman just walked in. So the king says, bring Haman in. And in verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Notice Haman in his pride and ego thought that there was no one greater than himself. He thought the king was planning to honor him. So he suggests several things that should be done for the person the king wished to honor. In verses 7 through 9, this man should have the appearance of royalty by wearing a kingly robe and riding a royal steed. The honored man should be served by the most noble princes, and they should take the man throughout the city on this royal horse, and they should clear the way for him. So verses 10 and 11, what irony. Haman himself had to carry out the king's order. Haman wanted respect so badly from Mordecai that he even planned to execute Mordecai, and now here he is giving honor to Mordecai. Verse 12 says he went home with his head covered in grief, and in verse 13 he tells his friends and family what had happened to him, and they responded with, if Mordecai is Jewish, meaning if he's in the providential care of God, he's a child of the promise, a child of the covenant? If he is, then you won't be able to stand against him. You will surely be defeated. Wow. Haman was really having a bad day. And in verse 14, then Haman was escorted to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Chapter 7, the wine's flowing freely, and the king just wants to know, Esther, what is your request? So in verses 3 and 4, she begins to share with the king what her request is. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Haman's day is about to get a whole lot worse. She just revealed she's Jewish, and she and her people have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Now she's making reference to the bribe that Haman offered to the king, the offer to pay the cover of the cost of this massacre. So also notice that Esther appeals to the king's self-interest. She says, if we were sold as slaves, then I would have remained silent, but we are going to be destroyed, and this will directly affect your revenues throughout the empire. What a loss to the king if the Jews are to be destroyed. Now, in verse 5, the king is outraged. He's like, well, who is this enemy? Who dares to do such a thing? And in verse 6, Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. It's just amazing. Can you imagine the knots in Haman's stomach when he learned that Esther is a Jew? She had amazing courage to identify with the very people who have been condemned to die. And in verse 7, the party's over. The king steps outside, but Haman stayed and begged for his life from Queen Esther. He's literally throwing himself on Esther, begging for mercy. And that's the irony in this whole story. That's what started this whole story. When Mordecai the Jew refused to bow down to Haman, Haman set out this entire Holocaust on the Jew. But now here Haman is bowing down to a Jew, Queen Esther, begging for his life. Now Haman was seized. He was taken by one of the king's officers, and the officer is like, oh, by the way, Haman has this 75-foot pole that he planned to hang Mordecai on. You know, Mordecai, the one who saved the king's life, the one you just promoted. So the king replied, perfect. Hang Haman on that. And I'm going to read chapter 7, verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Haman died on the very stake he had erected for his enemy. Pride always comes before the fall. Chapter 8. The king has learned that both Esther and Mordecai, they're both Jews. Verse 1 tells us he now learns that they're cousins. And in verse 2, the king gave his signet ring to Mordecai. Remember the signet ring, which had given Haman the authorization to kill the Jews? That was now given to Mordecai. Mordecai is now the king's right-hand man. Mordecai replaces Haman, and he rules from the very home that once belonged to his enemy. Esther set Mordecai over Haman's estate. Now, since the decree to annihilate the Jews was still in effect, Esther begged the king to put an end to Haman's evil plan. She says in verse 6, how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So she's insistent, she's bold, she's revealing her identity. She's saying, my people, my family. The king had publicly delegated authority to Haman by giving Haman his signet ring to act in authority. So he couldn't simply reverse this decree that Haman authorized, because that would compromise the king's decision making. So how is the king going to solve this problem? Verses 7 and 8, the king says, both Esther and Mordecai, you have the power and the resources that previously belonged to Haman, and you should use that power to your advantage. Mordecai, use the authority that comes with your new office and secure your people's deliverance. Verse 9, so the scribes were summoned, and a second decree was issued that would supersede the first decree. The wording in verse 11 parallels the original decree that said, destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children. This decree that Mordecai wrote, this decree now says that the king granted the Jews the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army or any people or province which might attack them, including women and children, and to plunder their spoils. So it's a right to protect themselves. In verses 16 and 17, fasting replaced with feasting, mourning replaced with rejoicing, grief replaced with gladness. And in verse 17, this is important. It says, and many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. It caused people, Gentiles, to realize that the God of the Jews was protecting them, and they followed the God of the Jews. So how amazing in that God's good hand was becoming obvious to the entire world. Chapter 9, we have Haman's decree and we have Mordecai's decree. One says kill, destroy, annihilate the Jews. One says, hey, by all means protect yourselves. The appointed day of battle has come and the enemies attack. The government authorities helped the Jews fight this battle. And in verse 5, this isn't retaliation, this is retribution. The goal of retribution is to punish the guilty, to protect the innocent, and to restore societal balance after a crime has been disrupted. So how do we know this was retribution? It's just by reading verse 10. The Jews did not take their enemies' possessions. They didn't take any of their goods. Verses 11 through 15, reports of the battle are brought to the king, and the king says to Esther, he's like, what is your wish? Do you have any further requests? And Esther asks, can I have one more day to get rid of these enemies? Remember, we talked about King Saul. He was Israel's first king, and he failed to get rid of the Amalekites. So here we are in Esther chapter 9. Saul's descendants, which is Esther and Mordecai, they have this unfinished business with the Amalekites. So Esther asked for one more day to carry out the tasks of rooting out the ones who were trying to destroy them, and the king permits it. Esther completed the task that Saul failed to do. Closing out chapter 9, the Jews defeated all of their enemies and instituted this feast called Purim. It's a feast that's still practiced today by the Jewish people. A 2-day feast for remembering the goodness of God, working to protect his people. Now in chapter 10 is awesome. It's only 3 verses and it discusses the greatness of Mordecai. Finding Jesus in the text, my favorite part in all these presentations. This story chapter by chapter is the gospel story. Starting with chapter 1, we have King Xerxes, a king with glory and riches, yet he has no power at all, which shifts the story to the greater king. God in his glory, riches, and sovereignty calls his subject to the throne, Esther, a Jew, to become queen. He makes everything work out according to his plan. God is in control. In chapter 2, we have Esther and Mordecai. They are strangers in the land. They have no power, no influence. Yet who does God use to accomplish his purposes and advance his kingdom? An orphan, a woman, a Jew. It is precisely here that Esther preaches the gospel to us, reminding us of Jesus Christ, who was stripped, beaten, crucified, the one who, though he was rich, became poor, that by his poverty we might become abundantly blessed. God uses his weakest servants for his greatest works. In chapter 3, Haman brings the whole Jewish world into mortal jeopardy, a call to destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews. Our adversary, the devil, brought the whole world into spiritual death. Since our first father Adam ate of the forbidden fruit, all humanity is condemned. Satan seeks to destroy, kill, and annihilate us. Romans 6 tells us the wages of sin is death, but God redeems. Genesis 3:15 is the promise of a Messiah who would relieve and deliver us, just like Esther chapter 4. The providence of God raised up a queen in a specific time in a special place. Esther determined to intercede on behalf of the people and plead for the people. Jesus, our mediator, one who laid it all down and died for his people. Esther declared, I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. The submission we see in Esther is surpassed and fulfilled in the Lord Jesus Christ. He went to the Father praying, not as I will, but as you will. Esther risked all to intercede for her people. We have a better mediator, one who laid it all down and died for his people. Chapter 5. On the 3rd day of fasting, she goes before the king to represent her people. 3 days Esther had been in the shadow of death, and on the 3rd day she approaches the king, and she received life, not death. Jesus Christ, who was betrayed and crucified because of our sins, was raised from the dead on the third day for our justification. Chapter 6. Mordecai had gone forgotten and unrewarded, but God didn't forget his covenant and his promises. God will and does keep his covenant with his people. Even Haman's wife knew that, saying, Mordecai is a child of the promise, a child of the covenant. You won't be able to stand against him. You will surely be defeated. 1 John 4:4 reminds us that the power of Christ who lives in the believer is greater than the power of the world. The battle is already won. Chapter 7, the enemy of God's people dies. That's Haman. We are all Haman in this story, by nature separated from God by sin. The one who dies in our place is Jesus, who knew no sin, became sin for us. The curse of the Jews was death. The curse for us is death, but God paid the debt for us. God himself reversed the rules for us. The pole Haman made for Mordecai, Haman himself was hung on. Haman's law was mortal death. Galatians 3:13 says Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. In chapter 8, verse 17, many from the nations who had been strangers to the covenant joined themselves to the people of God. Jesus died on the cross as payment for all our sins. He rose from death in resurrection, and that salvation is made available to the whole world. Chapter 9 and 10, though we fight a battle day by day with sin and the flesh and the devil, Jesus endured and experienced suffering. He identified with us on the deepest level of anguish with his suffering on the cross. He triumphed over sin, death, and Satan. Right, that's the story of Esther, your highlighted verse, the key truth. Chapter 4, verse 14, the significance. God will deliver us, but we have opportunities to stand up. God gives us a purpose, and we are to choose to take it. The immediate message of the book, it tells the story of Esther and the Feast of Purim, and the message to us: act faithfully even if God's directions aren't clear.